Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the show where we dig up old creatures from past editions of D&D and convert them for use in your current 5th edition D&D campaign. My name is Josiah, also known as Dungeon Dad, and today we are talking about a huge monster, both in terms of hype and its literal size. That's right, the Eldritch Giant is the subject of today's video, and these guys are just something else. See, in D&D 5th edition, we already have a bunch of other giants, so the question is, what makes the Eldritch Giant different, aside from being Eldritch? A word which, thanks to a certain author, has essentially lost all meaning and is basically just used to describe old magics. And that is exactly what makes the Eldritch Giant Eldritch, is old magics. See, their actual place within the ordning, the caste system which the giants use to organize their hierarchy, is kind of unknown. In fact, not much is known about how these giants fit in with the other giants. All that's really known is at some point in history they kind of separated and isolated themselves and devoted their lives entirely to the pursuit of discovering the arcane. As you can imagine, that makes them incredibly dangerous because they're not just massive creatures capable of swinging huge weapons, they're massive creatures capable of swinging huge weapons and casting spells. Fighting an Eldritch Giant is like fighting a barbarian who's also 40 feet tall and who also knows cantrips. Generally just a bad time. So as always, I have converted this monster from 3.5 when it was originally printed into 5th edition. You can find a Google document in the description below which contains all the information about running this monster in 5e. So today we're going to go over what it's like to run one of these guys in combat, how you can use them, as well as some plot hooks and adventure ideas for your game. If that sounds good to you, it sounds good to me, so be sure to like, leave a comment, all that good stuff helps me out tremendously. And if you're new here, we do one of these videos every week, so welcome to the show. Now, without further ado, get your best giant slaying weapons ready because it is time for... Your average D&D party when going up against a giant is going to be relying heavily on magic and casting spells. The reason for this, of course, being many giants have several resistances and they're all really physically strong. The best way to deal with a creature like that often has its roots in some type of magic. The Eldritch Giant is a whole different beast. The Eldritch Giant sets itself apart with its complete mastery and innate understanding of the arcane and how magic works. But you're not often going to see an Eldritch Giant roaming around wearing a cloak and various wizard robes. They're decked out in half-plate most of the time. Rather than a spell book, they tattoo their spells on their bodies. So all those markings and tattoos you see are actually meant to serve a purpose, that purpose being casting spells. The fact that they don't require a spell book frees up their hands to swing that giant axe. Speaking of which, that giant axe is definitely a factor in this whole equation, and I'm going to basically run down what the strategy an Eldritch Giant is going to employ is going to be when it gets into battle. When forced into a situation where fighting is the only option, the Eldritch Giant is typically going to start by casting some spells. It's not going to be using Fireball or any real aggressive magics. It's going to be casting things like Detect Magic, Dispel Magic, as well as Globe of Invulnerability and Shield. It's going to be doing these things to not only protect itself, but also strip away all the magical enhancements on its target. Once the giant feels that the most dangerous magic has been dispelled on its opponent, it's going to rush in. However, they have the capacity to cast Dimension Door 3 times a day, as well as Haste once. So it's at this point where the giant is going to cast Haste on itself, and then use Dimension Door to pop in, do a bunch of damage with those melee attacks, and then pop back out. This can make for a really interesting encounter because you have this huge hulking giant employing hit and run tactics, trying to leave itself exposed as little as possible. And then once it's exhausted its magic, it's going to run in and just start the slugfest. But by this point, the giant's enemies should be sufficiently worn down, so it's just coming in to clean up what's left. Because make no mistake, those physical attacks still hit like a truck. It's just not going to jump straight into melee because it has preparations to make. Something else I added here as well was an ability called Eldritch Storm. This essentially allows the giant to cast a giant version of Eldritch Blast with 4 beams that can each target a separate creature. I added this because the giants all need a ranged attack, and I thought it was kind of lame to just give them the same rock attack that all the other giants have, especially when they have all this magical thematics around them. Plus, Eldritch Blast was not a spell in 3rd edition, so it would be kind of dumb if we had an Eldritch Giant in 5th edition who couldn't even cast a version of Eldritch Blast. These giants are really smart, with an intelligence score of 20, so running them in combat should be really fun, because they know exactly what they're doing, and they've definitely done this before. Something else worth mentioning here as well is it has 2 other traits which aren't super important when it comes to talking about how they fight, but are relevant to how combat's going to play out. They have that same magic resistance that many other magical creatures have, which gives them advantage on saving throws against spells. And they also have an ability called Eldritch Mastery, which functions a lot like the Thief Rogue's ability. Essentially, this allows them to use any magical item regardless of what class that item is intended for. All of this is definitely going to leave your players with a pretty memorable combat encounter if that's how you choose to use them, but there are a lot of different ways that the Eldritch Giant can be a part of a game without necessarily involving combat. So let's move on and talk about some. Eldritch Giants are pretty dang awesome, and they break with a lot of the thematic stuff we typically think of when we think of giants. As I mentioned, they're highly intelligent, and to them, the most important priority is the pursuit of arcane knowledge. The original lore entry even goes as far as to say that they have a kind of ongoing blood feud with the Storm Giants, but they don't really care about it that much. It's all considered secondary to their pursuit of the arcane. I mean, if the opportunity arose where they could kill a few Storm Giants while also gaining some type of magical artifact, sure, but killing the Storm Giants would just be kind of like the cherry on top. It wouldn't really be the main goal of a raiding party. This can be really interesting if you have Storm Giants in your game, because who knows how the Storm Giants feel about this rivalry. Maybe they have a hatred for the Eldritch Giants that stretches beyond seeing them as a nuisance. If you think these monsters are cool and you're running the Storm King's Thunder adventure path, for example, throwing in an Eldritch Giant here or there could be really interesting. Another really fascinating thing about them that I briefly touched on earlier is that they tattoo their bodies with the runes to cast the spells that they want to cast. This is mostly a flavor detail, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If your party's in giant country, maybe they find a really rare spell scroll, but the spell scroll is actually a piece of tanned giant hide, and it was a tattoo that was once part of an Eldritch Giant's back or something. Or maybe there's an Eldritch Giant that has some type of really powerful arcane secret tattooed on them, and the party is tasked with taking them out so that they can retrieve it, even if it means killing the giant who's currently wearing that skin. If you want to use an Eldritch Giant as maybe a friendly NPC who can offer the party a reward in turn for doing something on their behalf, maybe the giant's willing to tattoo a spell onto one of the party members or on all of the party members so they have permanent access to a spell that they normally wouldn't have access to. So sure, the party wizard might get made fun of for having a tramp stamp, but it won't seem so funny when that tramp stamp casts Meteor Swarm on a group of enemies, now will it? I just love monsters like this whose ecology and history is largely unknown, because it kind of allows you as the DM to fill in the gaps yourself. You could completely ignore this whole thing about how they're not really part of the Ordning because they left and became very mysterious at some point in history. If you want to just include them as another group of giants in your world, you absolutely can. And maybe that's the source of their rivalry with the Storm Giants, is that they're kind of on equal terms as far as power goes, so maybe each of the two groups are vying for dominance of who should sit atop the Ordning and be in command of all other giants. If you wanted to go ham with that idea, you could set up an Eldritch Giant in a position of power kind of opposed to the Storm King. That could actually be a really interesting idea for the campaign if the party has to broker peace between these two giant kingdoms, because while the giants might not care about going to war with any human civilization caught between a war of two giant civilizations, especially two civilizations as powerful as a group of Eldritch Giants and Storm Giants, they're gonna have a bad time. All in all, the Eldritch Giant is just really awesome and gives us another option in terms of what we can do with giants that we don't already have access to, and for that I just had to cover them. Also, shouts out to DMW Kenton on the Dungeon Dad Discord for recommending this monster. It was recommended literally over a year ago, but as I always say, these things end up on the list and sooner or later I will cover them. So if you have a recommendation for a monster you'd like to see covered on Monster of the Week, maybe it's from an older version of D&D or Pathfinder or even another tabletop game and you want me to check it out, convert it to 5th edition and do a video about it, definitely let me know either in the comments, on Discord, or you can hit me up on Twitter. Speaking of the Discord, it's a cool place for cool people, so if you want to check that out, there's a link to that in the description below as well. There's always good D&D conversation going on there, specifically a lot of talk about monsters, who would have thought. And of course, there is a link in the description below as well that will bring up the Google document with all the stats for this monster, and if you are one of my lovely patrons, you will also get early access to what monsters I'm covering each week, along with a D&D 5th edition style monster stat block that has some extra lore and that kind of stuff on it. So if you like what I'm doing here and you want to support me and help me keep making videos, the Patreon is also linked down below with all the other stuff. Imagine that. But most importantly, thank you guys so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Until then.